I got a call from a booker at News Nation asking if I had seen this piece by Uri Berliner about NPR and would I be willing to comment on it. And the headline is, "I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust." The subheadline, Uri Berliner, a veteran at the public radio institution, says the network lost its way when it started telling listeners how to think. He does talk about how much NPR has felt like home for him and how much it means to him and how he feels to see what he describes as these changes at the network that he says have kind of destroyed NPR's credibility. He writes, "Back in 2011, although NPR's audience tilted a bit to the left, it still bore a resemblance to America at large. 26% of listeners described themselves as conservative, 23% as middle of the road, and 37% as liberal. By 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% described themselves as very or somewhat conservative, 21% as middle of the road, and 67% of listeners said they were very or somewhat liberal. An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. That wouldn't be a problem for an openly polemical news outlet serving a niche audience. But for NPR, which purports to consider all things, it's devastating, both for its journalism and its business model," unquote. My reactions to this piece were that it laid out an array of things which may well be worth addressing, but it laid out no path to address them. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, NPR got very dogmatic, in his view, very dogmatic about the way that it covered matters of race, particularly systemic racism. And according to Uri Berliner, John Lansing, the former CEO, said that diversity among NPR's staff was, in his words, the North Star of the organization. And that began an array of DEI efforts, and DEI has been super controversial, but an array of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at NPR, which Uri Berliner takes huge issue with. He does note that NPR is very important to him. He said that working at NPR has been, in his words, a source of great pride. He describes it as a crown jewel of American journalism, has good things to say about his colleagues, calls them congenial, hardworking. So if you haven't read the piece, it's not going to read like a beatdown. He doesn't do that. And then he goes on to commit one of, I think, his logical errors in this piece. He says that he looked at the voter registration figures for the newsroom, which I guess you can do. Those are public records, but ew, creepy. Don't do that anyway. He says he looked at voter registration in D.C., where NPR is headquartered, and he found, of, I guess, at least the people who live in the District of Columbia, and plenty of people who work at NPR don't, they'll live in Maryland or Virginia. He says that he found 87 registered Democrats in editorial positions and 0 Republicans. He says that he presented this in an all-hands editorial staff meeting in May of 2021, suggested there was a diversity problem, and says, quote, "The response wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was met with profound indifference. I got a few messages from surprised, curious colleagues, but the messages were of the, oh, wow, that's weird variety, as if the lopsided tally was a random anomaly rather than a critical failure of our diversity North Star," unquote. So he is connecting diversity efforts, which often have to do with immutable characteristics like race or sexual orientation, with something you literally choose on a piece of paper. That is but one of his logical errors. Here's another one. Looked at voter registration, found 87 Democrats and 0 Republicans. Who did he neglect to look for? The largest slice of the American electorate is not Democrats or Republicans. It's independents. Democrats hover between 20-30%. Republicans hover between 20-30%. Independents are well above 40, sometimes almost 50% of the U.S. electorate, according to Gallup polls. And Gallup polls on this every month for decades and decades. We are not a nation of Democrats versus Republicans. We're a nation of partisans versus nonpartisans. I wish I had been his editor. I would have bled all over this with a red pen. You dug into your colleagues' voter registrations? How did you feel about that? There is an emotional piece to the story in that moment where you're so mad or disgusted or upset or hurt at the political composition of your coworkers that you reach a point where you say you are going to expose them and discuss something that nice people don't talk about at parties. There's a reason you go into the voting booth alone. There's a reason we keep those things mostly private. And you had the nerve, the bald-faced indignation to put that out for public consumption. How did you justify that decision to yourself? Or did it not occur to you? Beyond that, he also goes into an array of the efforts where he's tried to kind of get people to hear him. He notes one email that he wrote to a top news executive, doesn't say who, but to a top news executive about times where NPR covered the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. He notes that the network mentioned the bill numerous times when the bill does not have the word gay in it. Now, you might notice in this piece, and this is another thing I would smack him for if I was his editor, there's a hyperlink there, education bill in Florida. But when you click this link, it takes you to the page for the Florida State Senate for the bill itself. So instead of showing me the issue, you link me to something that actually does not bolster your argument at all. Okay, fine. He does also say that the emphasis on this so-called North Star, on diversity, has been a large factor in the audience pulling further to the left and in reflecting NPR's pull further to the left. He notes that as of last year, 6% of NPR's news audience was Black, far short of the overall U.S. adult population, which is 14.4% Black. Hispanics were only 7% compared to the overall Hispanic adult population, around 19%. The last time I checked, when you tried to set a number for how many Black people should be in an organization's network, that's called a quota. Are you saying that NPR is not meeting its Black quota? When I was on News Nation, I made it clear that even if he's correct about these things, the primary liability, the fatal flaw of this piece, is that it doesn't suggest any solutions. This guy's been there for 25 years. If you look on Mr. Berliner's bio, it notes that among the projects he helped to build was Planet Money, which is a podcast about business and money and being a consumer. So let me get this straight. You know how to build things at NPR. You know how to get things done. And nowhere in your piece do you mention any stories that you've pitched or projects that you've suggested or calls you've made to member stations to try to get something going. Nothing. Anyone who knows NPR from the inside knows the power at NPR is not at the network. Stations founded NPR to serve their needs. It's with the member stations. I don't care what your conversation was with John Lansing. I want to know, what were your conversations like with Harvest Public Media or Iowa Public Radio or Georgia Public Broadcasting or KERA in Dallas or KUT in Austin or WBUR in Boston, or as the receptionist there says, WBUI. I want to know what your conversations were like with them. Did you ever talk to anybody at KJZZ in the Fronteras desk down in Phoenix, Arizona? If you're really concerned about the number of Hispanics who are listening, did you talk to a station that literally covers the southern border? Did you talk to anyone? Or worse, have you reached the point where you've given up? Where you've become kind of so blinded by your irritation and sense of entitlement that you no longer have the capacity to go out and build things? Is that what happened? How can we trust you to be part of the solution ever? How can we trust you to do the work? And here's the kicker. He didn't tell his bosses about this article before he dropped it. He just dropped it. How many of you could do something like that and keep your job?